A single request for a bottle of water. That's all it was. A simple human request. But on board a transatlantic flight, that request was denied. A veteran flight attendant looked a 16-year-old black teenager in the eye and refused. What she didn't know was that this teenager wasn't just any passenger. He was the son of one of the most powerful men in the country. And in the time it takes to drink a glass of water, she wouldn't just lose her job. She would trigger a chain of events that would see the entire flight crew fired before the plane even reached its destination. This isn't just a story about bad service. It's about the terrifying, unseen power that shapes our world and the devastating karma that follows a single, chilling decision. The cabin of a Boeing 787, 38,000 feet over the vast, indifferent blue of the Atlantic, is a world unto itself. It's a pressurized, climate-controlled tube of recycled air and muted expectations hurtling through the stratosphere at over 500 miles per hour. For the passengers, it's a temporary purgatory, a necessary inconvenience for the price of passage. For the crew, it is a stage, an office, and a battlefield, all confined within the sleek white fuselage. On this particular morning, on a direct flight from New York's JFK to London Heathrow, the atmosphere in first class was one of practiced serenity. The champagne flutes were chilled, the noise-cancelling headphones were distributed, and the gentle hum of the Rolls-Royce engines was a lullaby of progress. In seat 4A sat Leo Washington. At 16, he was lanky, all limbs and quiet observation, dressed in the understated uniform of the modern affluent teenager, a simple grey hoodie from a brand no one over 25 would recognize. Expensive sneakers and AirPods nestled in his ears. He wasn't listening to music, however. He was listening to the world around him, a habit instilled in him by his father. Pay attention to the details, Leo David Washington always said. Power isn't in the grand gestures, it's in knowing which details matter. Leo was on his way to a global youth leadership summit in London, a passenger manifest entry that belied the reality of his journey. He wasn't just another gifted teen. He was the only son of David Washington, the founder and CEO of the Leviathan tech firm, Ethelred, a company whose software ran the logistical backbone of nearly half the Fortune 500 companies. David Washington was a name whispered with a mixture of awe and fear in boardrooms from Silicon Valley to Shanghai. He was a kingmaker, a market mover, a man who could reshape industries with a single email. And Leo, his son, was the quiet prince, taught from birth to navigate a world that both courted and coveted him. Presiding over the first-class cabin was Carolyn Hayes. At 54, Carolyn was a portrait of immaculate professionalism. Her salt-and-pepper hair was swept into a flawless chignon. Her uniform was crisp, and her smile, though as bright, never quite reached her eyes. She had been a flight attendant for 30 years, a career she began when flying was still a glamorous affair. She remembered the clink of real silverware, the generous seat pitches the deference of passengers who saw the crew as pilots of the cabin, not just airborne servers. Now she felt like a glorified waitress, fending off a ceaseless barrage of entitled demands. She took immense pride in her work, in her seniority, in the precise, orderly ballet of a perfectly executed long-haul service. She saw the cabin not as a space filled with people, but as a system to be managed. Every passenger was a variable, every request a potential disruption to the delicate equilibrium she so painstakingly maintained. She wasn't a racist in the overt, ugly sense of the word. She didn't harbor active malice. Instead, she possessed a more insidious, more common prejudice, an unconscious bias that sorted the world into hierarchies. In her mind, There were the seasoned business travelers, the old money couples, the celebrities, people who belonged in her cabin, who understood the unspoken rules. And then there were the others, the ones on award tickets, the nouveau riche, the teenagers who seemed out of place. Her eyes had flicked over Leo Washington when he boarded. She noted the hoodie, the sneakers, the youthful slouch, an anomaly in her curated space. She mentally categorized him probably a musician or an athlete's kid, someone with money but not class, someone who would likely be a source of minor annoyance. Her initial interactions were clip deficient. "Can I get you a pre-departure beverage, sir?" She'd asked the sir, a thin veneer of respect over a flat, dismissive tone. "Just a water, please." Leo had replied, his voice polite, unassuming. Carolyn's smile tightened a fraction. "Of course," she returned with a small plastic cup of water, placing it on his console without a word, before turning her attention to the man in 5A, a portly executive in a tailored suit, greeting him with a familiar warmth. "Mr. Henderson, so good to have you back with us. The usual champagne." Leo watched the exchange, a familiar pang of invisibility washing over him. He'd felt it 1,000 times. The way store clerks followed him, the way doormen questioned him, the way people like Carolyn looked right through him. He took a sip of water and turned his gaze to the window, watching the ground crew scurry below like ants. He wasn't angry. He was just tired. He was an observer, and this was just another detail to note. For now. The plane took off a powerful rumbling ascent that pushed him back into the plush leather of his seat. As they leveled off and the seatbelt sign pinged off Carolyn and her junior crew members, began the main service. There were 2 other flight attendants in first class Peter Davies, a young man in his late 20s with a perpetually nervous energy, eager to please but terrified of missteps, and Maria Flores, a sharp, efficient woman in her 40s who followed Carolyn's lead without question. Carolyn was the undisputed queen of this domain. Peter and Maria were her loyal subjects. They moved with a practiced choreography, their motions dictated by her sharp glances and subtle hand gestures. She was a demanding leader, one who valued procedure above all else. A misplaced napkin or a forgotten pre-order was a cardinal sin. Peter, in particular, lived in a state of low-grade fear of her disapproval. An hour into the flight, Leo finished his small cup of water. He felt the familiar dryness in his throat that always came with flying. He looked around for Carolyn, but she was busy schmoozing with Mr. Henderson, laughing at a joke he'd made. Leo waited. He waited for 10 minutes. When Peter walked past, his movements, hurried Leo tried to catch his eye. "Excuse me," Leo said, his voice quiet. Peter flinched, startled. "Yes, sir. Could I please have another bottle of water?" "Of course," Peter said, relief washing over his face at the simplicity of the request. He turned toward the galley, but Carolyn's voice cut through the cabin's hum, sharp and cold as ice. "Peter, a moment." Peter froze, his shoulders slumping. He turned and walked to the galley, where Carolyn stood with her arms crossed. Leo couldn't hear their words, but he could see the dynamic plain as day. Carolyn spoke in a low, firm tone. Peter nodded his head, bowed. He glanced back towards Leo, a flicker of apology in his eyes, before busying himself with polishing wine glasses. He did not return. Leo waited. Another 10 minutes passed. The dehydration was becoming a nagging headache. He was a 16-year-old boy who just wanted a drink of water. He pressed the call button. The light chimed softly above his seat. Seconds turned into a minute. A minute turned into 2. In the rarefied air of first class, where needs were meant to be anticipated, not requested. 2 minutes was an eternity. Finally, Carolyn appeared at his seat, her professional smile plastered on her face, but her eyes were flinty. "Yes," she asked, the single word dripping with impatience. "Hi," Leo said, still polite, still calm. "I asked for a water about 20 minutes ago. I was just wondering if I could get a bottle." Carolyn tilted her head, a gesture of feigned thoughtfulness. "We're about to begin the main meal service. You will be served a beverage with your meal." "I know," Leo said. "I'm just really thirsty now. I'd appreciate a bottle if it's not too much trouble." Here Carolyn made her choice. It was a small decision, a tiny pivot point on which her entire world would soon turn. She could have simply said, of course, walked the 10 feet to the galley and retrieved a bottle of water. The interaction would have been forgotten. But in that moment, looking down at the teenager in the hoodie, all her frustrations, her sense of waning authority, her unconscious biases coalesced into a single stubborn word. "The bottled water," she said, her voice now taking on a condescending, instructive tone, "is reserved for our Platinum Medallion and Centurion card-holding members during the initial beverage service. As we are now in the pre-meal phase, all beverages must be served with the meal presentation to ensure a streamlined service." It was a masterful piece of corporate jargon, a rule invented on the spot designed to sound official, final, and utterly ridiculous. Leo knew it was ridiculous. He had flown this route dozens of times. He had seen people get bottles of water whenever they asked. "I'm pretty sure that's not a real rule," Leo said, his politeness finally fraying at the edges. "I just want a bottle of water." The smile vanished from Carolyn's face. Her mask of professionalism slipped, revealing the raw contempt beneath. "Are you calling me a liar?" "No," Leo said, taking a breath, trying to channel his father's unnerving calm. "I'm just saying I'm a passenger in first class, and I'm asking for a bottle of water. It seems like a simple request." "It's not about what's simple, it's about procedure." Carolyn snapped her voice, rising just enough to turn the heads of Mr. Henderson and the woman across the aisle. "And the procedure is you will wait for the meal service." She turned her back on him and walked away, a picture of righteous authority. Leo sat there stunned. It wasn't just a refusal anymore. It was a power play. She had deliberately and publicly humiliated him. He could feel the stares of the other passengers. He felt small, angry, and worst of all, powerless. He looked over at Peter, who was now studiously avoiding his gaze, his hands trembling slightly as he arranged cutlery on a tray. He saw Maria, who simply stared straight ahead, her face a mask of indifference. They were complicit in their silence. They had chosen their queen. Leo took a deep breath. He thought of his father's words. Power isn't in grand gestures. It's in knowing which details matter. This detail mattered. He pulled out his phone. There was no cell service, of course, but the airline's expensive, sluggish Wi-Fi was active. He typed a short, simple message to a number he knew by heart. It wasn't his father's. It was the number for his father's chief of staff, a woman named Catherine Shaw, a person whose entire job was to make problems big and small disappear. The message was brief, on AA100 to LHR. Flight attendant Carolyn in first class refusing to give me water. Making a scene. Please handle. He hit send. The message icon showed a single check mark. Then 2. Delivered. He put his phone away, leaned his head back against the seat, and closed his eyes. The Queen had made her move. Now the board was about to change. For 45 minutes, the cabin returned to its stilted version of normalcy. The meal service began. Peter, his face pale and his hands still unsteady, served Leo his pan-seared salmon with a quiet, almost inaudible, "Enjoy your meal, sir." He placed a glass of water finally next to the plate. Leo just nodded his appetite, gone. Carolyn, meanwhile, moved through the cabin with a renewed sense of command, her victory over the upstart teenager seemingly solidifying her authority. She laughed with Mr. Henderson refilled his wine glass twice and operated as if the preceding conflict had never occurred. It was to her a minor skirmish expertly handled, a non-issue. Leo ate a few bites of his fish and then pushed the plate away. He sipped the water. He felt a profound sense of loneliness, the kind that can only exist in a crowd. He was a boy in a box in the sky, a pawn in a game he hadn't asked to play. But he had sent the message. He had lit the fuse. Now he could only wait. The first sign that something was amiss came not from the cabin but from the flight deck. A soft double chime echoed through the cabin, the sound the crew uses for internal calls. It wasn't the passenger call button. It was the phone from the cockpit. Carolyn, who was in the galley preparing a cheese plate, picked it up. "First Class Hayes speaking." Leo watched her. Her posture stiffened. Her back, which was facing the cabin, went ramrod straight. She said, "Yes, Captain," 3 times each one, with a rising note of confusion. She hung up the phone and stood motionless for a moment, her hand still resting on the receiver. She turned, and for the first time her mask of unflappable control was gone. Her face was a canvas of pure bewilderment. She looked at Peter and Maria. "The captain wants to see me. In the cockpit. Now." This was not normal. Cabin crew were rarely summoned to the flight deck mid-flight unless there was a serious medical emergency or a security threat. Peter and Maria exchanged a wide-eyed, nervous glance. Carolyn smoothed her uniform, a reflexive gesture of control, in a situation that was clearly spiraling beyond her understanding. She walked the length of the first-class cabin, her stride less confident now, and disappeared through the reinforced door to the cockpit. The minutes stretched on. 15. Passengers began to murmur. Mr. Henderson looked up from his wine. "Everything all right?" he asked Maria. "I'm sure it is, sir," she replied, her voice lacking conviction. Then the captain's voice crackled over the PA system. Not the calm, folksy, "we're seeing a bit of turbulence ahead" voice, but a tone that was flat formal and utterly devoid of emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to an unforeseen, operational issue with our cabin crew, we will be diverting our flight. We have been cleared for landing at Halifax Stanfield International Airport in Nova Scotia. We will be on the ground in approximately 30 minutes. Cabin crew, please prepare the cabin for landing. Thank you." A wave of confusion and annoyance rippled through the entire plane. An operational issue with the cabin crew. What did that even mean? Diverting to Canada. The flight was halfway to London. People had connections to make, meetings to attend. Angry muttering erupted from every class. In first class, the announcement landed like a bomb. Peter and Maria looked utterly lost. They began to mechanically clear the meal trays, their movements clumsy and uncertain. The cockpit door opened and Carolyn emerged. If her face had been bewildered before, it was now a mask of ashen horror. Her eyes were wide, unfocused. She looked as though she had seen a ghost. She stumbled back into the galley, leaning against a counter for support. "What is it? What's happening?" Maria hissed. Carolyn shook her head, unable to form words. She just stared into the middle distance, her mind clearly replaying the conversation that had just taken place on the other side of that door. That conversation had been short and brutal. The captain, a stern veteran named Frank Miller, had not asked for her side of the story. He had delivered a message that had come from the highest levels of the airline's corporate headquarters in Fort Worth, Texas. A message that had been relayed to him via ACAR's, the aircraft's satellite communication system. The message had been explicit. A-100 is to divert to Halifax YHZ immediately. A replacement crew is being assembled. Upon landing, your entire flight and cabin crew's credentials are to be revoked, and they are to be escorted from the airport. Reason: a Class 1. Passenger complaint filed by the office of David Washington, CEO of Ethelred. The captain had looked at her, not with anger, but with a kind of weary pity. "I don't know what you did, Carolyn," he had said, his voice low, "but you pissed off a king. My orders are to ground this plane and terminate your employment and that of your entire crew as soon as we touch down. Now go and prepare the cabin for landing." The reality was so enormous, so disproportionate to the perceived crime, that her brain couldn't process it. David Washington. She knew the name, of course. Ethelred. The tech giant. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening thud. The boy in the hoodie. The quiet, polite teenager. It wasn't an athlete's kid. It wasn't a rapper's son. It was him. Panic, cold and absolute, finally broke through her shock. This wasn't a reprimand. This wasn't a write-up. This was the end of her career. 30 years of service, of pride, of identity, erased mid-flight over a bottle of water. As the plane began its descent into Halifax, the mood in the cabin was tense and miserable. Everyone knew this was no ordinary diversion. When the plane finally taxied to a remote stand on the tarmac far from the main terminal, the feeling of dread was palpable. The jet bridge did not approach. Instead, a set of air stairs was wheeled to the forward door. At the bottom of the stairs, a group of people waited. They weren't airport ground crew. They were men in dark suits. Canadian police officers stood beside them, their expressions impassive, and standing slightly apart was a severe-looking woman in a sharp corporate blazer holding a tablet. The captain's voice came on the PA again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived in Halifax. Please remain in your seats. The authorities and airline representatives will be boarding the aircraft momentarily." The first-class door was opened. The woman in the blazer ascended the stairs, her heels clicking with grim purpose. She was followed by two of the suits. She didn't look at the passengers. Her eyes scanned the crew. "Carolyn Hayes, Peter Davies, Maria Flores," she said, her voice sharp and clear, reading from her tablet. "I am Sarah Jenkins, Senior Vice President of In-Flight Services for American Airlines. By order of the board, your employment is terminated effective immediately. Your airline credentials and security clearances are revoked. You will be escorted from the aircraft. Your personal belongings will be collected and shipped to you. Do not attempt to contact any other crew members. Do not speak to any passengers. You will now follow these gentlemen." It was executed with the cold, brutal efficiency of a corporate assassination. There was no argument, no appeal. Maria let out a small, strangled sob. Peter looked like he was about to vomit. He stared at Leo, his eyes pleading as if the boy could somehow undo this. But Leo just looked down at his hands, his face unreadable. He had lit the fuse, but the explosion was far bigger than he could have ever imagined. Carolyn, however, was not going to go quietly. The shock had worn off, replaced by a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. Her life was being dismantled in front of an audience, and the injustice of it all overwhelmed her. "You can't do this!" she shrieked, her voice echoing in the stunned silence of the cabin. 30 years I have given this company, 30 years of my life over a spoiled brat who wanted a bottle of water." Her eyes locked on Leo. All pretense of professionalism, of decorum, of basic human decency vanished. "You," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at him. "You did this. You little monster. You had to call your daddy. I hope you're happy. You've ruined our lives." One of the suits moved swiftly, stepping between her and Leo. "Ma'am, you need to come with us now." But Carolyn was beyond reason. She was a cornered animal lashing out. She tried to push past the man, her face contorted in a mask of fury. This was the moment another passenger, a woman in seat 3B, who had been quietly filming the entire interaction on her phone since the initial water refusal zoomed in. She captured the moment of Carolyn's final desperate career-ending meltdown. The finger-pointing, the screaming, the sheer ugly breakdown of a woman who had just lost everything. The security men took Carolyn by the arms. She struggled, but it was useless. They were professionals. They half-dragged, half-walked her down the aisle and out the door, her tirade echoing behind her. Peter and Maria followed, weeping like prisoners, being led to their execution. As they were escorted down the stairs and into a waiting black van on the tarmac, the passengers in first class sat in stunned, horrified silence. Mr. Henderson stared into his empty champagne glass as if it held the answers to the universe. The woman in 3B stopped recording, a grimly satisfied look on her face. And Leo Washington, the 16-year-old boy at the center of it all, finally looked up. He stared out the window, watching the black van drive away across the rain-slicked tarmac, carrying 3 people whose lives had just been irrevocably shattered. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't what he wanted. Or was it? He didn't know. He just knew that the details had mattered, and the consequences were terrifyingly real. The internet is not a court of law. It has no judge, no jury, no due process. It is a court of public opinion, a digital town square where outrage is the currency and context is the first casualty. Its justice is swift, brutal, and often final. For Carolyn Hayes, the verdict was delivered before her plane even had a new crew. The passenger in seat 3B, a marketing consultant from Chicago named Brenda Walsh, had a significant social media following. She wasn't an influencer in the traditional sense, but she was a savvy, well-connected professional who knew the power of a viral narrative. As soon as she had a stable internet connection on the ground in Halifax, she uploaded the video. She didn't edit it. She just posted the raw 3-minute clip to her Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram accounts. Her caption was simple and devastatingly effective. On board AA-100, this flight attendant Carolyn refused to give a black teenager a bottle of water, then had a meltdown when the plane was diverted and she was fired. The privilege is astounding. The racism is textbook. This is American Airlines in 2025. The video was a perfect storm of viral ingredients. It had a clear villain, the screaming, finger-pointing Carolyn, a sympathetic victim, the calm, polite black teen, a dramatic plot twist, the plane diversion, and a satisfying immediate consequence, the on-camera firing. Within the first hour, it had 1,000 retweets. Then it was picked up by Sean King. The activist and writer with his millions of followers shared the video with a single damning question. Her name is Carolyn Hayes. She worked for American Airlines for 30 years. Was it worth it to deny a child a glass of water? That was the spark that ignited the inferno. From there, the fire spread with terrifying speed. Major news outlets, CNN. The New York Times. The Guardian scraped the video from social media and ran stories. The headlines were brutal. Flight attendant fired mid-flight after refusing water to black teen. Viral video shows crew escorted off plane in racism row. You little monster, airline workers' tirade costs her 30-year career. Carolyn Hayes was no longer a person. She was a meme, a hashtag. Hashtag Watergate, nahat flight attendant. Carolyn airline. Karen. Her face, contorted in that final moment of rage, was screenshotted and plastered everywhere. People dug up her old Facebook profile, sharing photos of her on vacation with her cats, smiling at holiday parties. They were presented as evidence of a life of unexamined privilege, now rightfully forfeited. Her digital life was picked apart by millions of strangers, each comment a fresh spade of dirt on the grave of her reputation. For Carolyn herself, the experience was a surreal nightmare. After being processed by the airline representatives in a sterile, windowless room at Halifax Airport, she was given a one-way economy ticket back to her home in Queens, New York, and a box containing the contents of her locker. She was told a third-party service would handle the shipping of her other belongings. She was now a non-person to the company she had called home for 3 decades. Her flight back was a blur of shame. She huddled in a window seat at the back of the plane, a scarf pulled over her face, praying no one would recognize her. But it was already too late. As she deplaned at LaGuardia, she saw her own face staring back at her from a TV screen above a newsstand. The sound was off, but the images were unmistakable. The airplane cabin, her own screaming face, the stoic teenager. Her stomach lurched. When she got back to her small, tidy apartment, the dam of her composure finally broke. She collapsed onto her sofa and wept for her job, for her pride, for the life that had been so unceremoniously ripped away. The next morning, the true scope of her new reality began to set in. Her photo was on the front page of the New York Post. Her apartment building's address had been leaked on a far-right blog that ironically was trying to defend her. A news van was parked across the street. Her phone, which she had turned off in Halifax, was a minefield. Hundreds of texts, thousands of notifications, voicemails from reporters, from old colleagues, from distant relatives. And then there were the messages from strangers, a torrent of digital venom. I hope you never work again. Racist witch. You got what you deserved. There were death threats, graphic and terrifying. Carolyn Hayes was now a public spectacle, a modern-day Hester Prynne with a smartphone instead of a scarlet letter. Her friends, the ones she had flown with for years, went silent. A few sent tentative, pitying texts. Thinking of you. This is just awful. But no one called. They were afraid. The message from the airline had been clear. Carolyn was radioactive, and anyone associated with her was at risk of contamination. Her attempt to find new work was a lesson in abject futility. She was 54, with a single highly specialized line on her resume. Who hires a 54-year-old flight attendant who was fired in the most public way imaginable? She tried applying for retail management positions for customer service roles. In the first interview for a job as an assistant manager at a high-end department store, the hiring manager was polite but distant. As the interview concluded, he looked at her resume, then back at her. "Your name is Carolyn Hayes," he said, more a statement than a question. "Yes," Carolyn replied, her heart sinking. "I thought I recognized you." The manager said, his eyes cold. "We'll be in touch." She never heard from him again. She quickly learned to use a slightly different name on applications, But the moment they saw her face in an interview or ran a background check, and her legal name popped up, the result was the same. Her digital footprint was an anchor dragging her down into a sea of unemployability. Within a month, she was bleeding money. Her savings meant for a comfortable retirement were now being used for rent and groceries. The shame was a constant companion, a heavy cloak she couldn't take off. She stopped leaving her apartment, except for essential trips, always wearing a hat and sunglasses. Her head bowed. The world that had once been her stage was now a place of fear and judgment. This was the hard karma, the slow, grinding consequence that the viral videos never show. It wasn't just about losing a job. It was about losing a future, a past, and a present. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of her decision washed over the two people who had stood by and done nothing. Peter Davies, the junior flight attendant, found himself in a different kind of hell. He wasn't the villain of the story. He was a footnote. But he was just as fired, just as unemployable. He returned to his small hometown in Ohio, his dreams of traveling the world shattered. He was consumed by a toxic cocktail of guilt and resentment. He resented Carolyn for her arrogance and for putting him in that impossible position. He resented the airline for its ruthless collective punishment. But most of all, he resented himself. He replayed the moment in his mind 1,000 times a day. Leo asking for water, Carolyn telling him to stop. He could have just grabbed the bottle anyway. He could have quietly taken it to the boy and said, "Here you go." What was the worst Carolyn could have done? Write him up. It was nothing compared to this. His guilt was suffocating. He believed he deserved to be fired. His silence, his inaction, had made him an accomplice. He tried to explain this to his family, but they didn't understand. "It wasn't your fault, son," his father would say. "You were just following orders." But Peter knew better. His failure was not one of action, but of character. He had seen something wrong and chosen the path of least resistance, and the price had been his career and his self-respect. Unlike Carolyn, who was trapped in a prison of righteous indignation, Peter was trapped in a prison of his own making. He started drinking heavily, the days bleeding into one another in a haze of cheap whiskey and self-loathing. He was a ghost haunted by the memory of a simple request for water. Maria Flores had a different, more pragmatic but equally devastating outcome. She had a family, a husband, and 2 young children. Her flight attendant salary was essential. She landed back in her home city of Miami to a husband who was terrified and angry. Her name was out there linked to the incident. They had a mortgage. They had car payments. She immediately scrubbed her social media, went into full lockdown mode, and tried to disappear. She felt that what Carolyn did was unprofessional, but the corporate response was terrifying. She, like Peter, had been a bystander, but unlike Peter, she felt no guilt. She felt only fear. She had followed the senior attendant's lead. That's what you did. You didn't make waves. You did your job and went home. Now her adherence to that unspoken rule had cost her everything. She saw herself not as an accomplice, but as collateral damage, an innocent bystander hit by a stray bullet in a war between giants. Her struggle became about pure survival, about finding a way to feed her family in a world that had branded her as part of a toxic crew. The digital guillotine had fallen not just on the neck of the person who committed the crime, but on everyone standing on the scaffold. And for Leo Washington, the boy who had simply wanted a drink, the fallout was becoming a burden he was never meant to carry. In the immediate aftermath, As the story exploded online, the Washington family erected a fortress of silence. Calls from reporters to Ethelred's corporate communications department were met with a polite but firm, "We have no comment on the private affairs of the Washington family." David Washington, a man notoriously private and allergic to the press, remained invisible. But behind the walls of their sprawling Manhattan penthouse, the mood was far from triumphant. Leo was shaken. He had spent the night in a Halifax hotel with an Ethelred security team before being flown to London on a private jet. He had arrived at the Youth Leadership Summit. But he couldn't focus. His phone buzzed incessantly with notifications from friends and classmates. "Dude, did you see this? You're famous. OMG, that flight attendant is crazy." He wasn't famous. He was infamous, and he felt sick. The viral video, the screaming headlines, the vitriolic comments, it was a maelstrom he had unleashed with a single text message. He hadn't wanted this. He hadn't wanted Carolyn Hayes's face plastered across the globe as a symbol of racist evil. He hadn't wanted Peter Davies and Maria Flores, two people he didn't even know, to lose their livelihoods. He had wanted... what? An apology for Carolyn to be reprimanded, for her to feel a fraction of the humiliation he had felt. Yes. But this wholesale destruction, it felt wrong. It felt like using a sledgehammer to kill a fly. When his father finally called him in London, his voice wasn't angry, but it carried a weight that Leo could feel through the phone. "Are you all right, son?" David asked. It was always his first question. "I'm fine," Leo mumbled. "It's a lot." "I know," David said. There was a long pause. What she did was unacceptable. It wasn't about the water, Leo. It was about respect. It was about her trying to establish that you did not belong in that space, that cannot and will not be tolerated. "But their jobs," Leo started. "The whole crew, Dad, they fired all of them right there on the tarmac." "That was the airline's decision," David said, his voice cool and precise. "When a company like Salesforce or Microsoft signs a multi-billion-dollar logistics contract with Ethelred, that contract includes certain standards of service and conduct for our executives from our partners. That courtesy extends to my family. American Airlines failed to meet that standard in a spectacular fashion. Their response was a business decision designed to protect their relationship with us. It was efficient." The word hung in the air. Efficient. It was the same word one might use to describe a software patch or a server upgrade. It was the word of a man who dealt in systems, not people. Leo realized that for his father, Carolyn Hayes and her crew weren't people. They were a systemic failure, a bug in the code that needed to be swiftly and ruthlessly purged. "People are saying I did it," Leo said, his voice small, "that I'm some spoiled rich kid who got people fired." "You know who you are, Leo," David said, his tone softening slightly. "And I know who you are. The opinions of anonymous strangers on the internet are just noise. Block it out. Focus on your summit. This will pass." But it didn't feel like noise. It felt like 1,000 accusing fingers pointing at him. He had wielded his father's immense unseen power, and the reality of its force was sickening. The crown of being a Washington, he was learning, was heavier than he had ever imagined. A few days later, seeking to control the narrative, David Washington's Chief of Staff, Catherine Shaw, released a formal statement. It was a masterclass in corporate public relations, drafted not by a family spokesperson, but by Ethelred's top legal and PR minds. The statement read, "The incident aboard flight AA-100 is deeply regrettable. The Washington family wishes to express their dismay at the turn of events. While the initial interaction was unfortunate, their sole intention was to report a failure in customer service to the airline. The subsequent decisions regarding the employment of the crew were made unilaterally by American Airlines. The Washingtons do not condone public shaming and hope for a swift and private resolution for all individuals involved. The family's primary concern has always been and remains fostering an environment of mutual respect. To that end, Ethelred will be making a significant donation to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund to support their ongoing work in combating racial discrimination. The statement was brilliant. It expressed regret without admitting fault, condemned the consequences while absolving them of responsibility, and pivoted to a show of philanthropic support for a revered civil rights organization. Benjamin Crump himself even retweeted it with a note of approval. It was a checkmate. To the public, it painted the Washingtons as victims of an overzealous corporate partner, benevolent and committed to social justice. The donation was real, a 7-figure sum that further solidified Ethelred's image. But for Carolyn Hayes, living in her self-imposed prison in Queens, the statement was like a match being thrown on a puddle of gasoline. Regrettable unilateral decision. They had called in the hit. They had dropped the bomb. And now they were standing back, dusting off their hands and pretending to be horrified by the crater. This was her rock bottom. The money was running out. The isolation was absolute. The public narrative had been cemented, casting her as the sole villain and the Washingtons as reluctant, dignified victims. One evening after seeing the statement praised on a cable news show, something in her broke. All the rage, the indignation, the self-pity, it all just evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, aching void. She sat at her small kitchen table, the eviction notice from her landlord lying next to a pile of unpaid bills. For the first time, she didn't think about the injustice of it all. She thought about the boy. She remembered his face. He hadn't been aggressive. He hadn't been entitled. He had been polite, quiet. He had just wanted a bottle of water. Why hadn't she just given it to him? The question echoed in the silence of her apartment. Why? She tried to reconstruct her own logic from that day. Procedure, order, platinum members. It all sounded so flimsy now, so pathetic. It was a lie. She had lied to him. She had lied to herself. The real reason was uglier, and it was buried deeper. It was the hoodie, the sneakers, the assumption that he didn't belong, the subconscious calculation that he was someone she could dominate, someone on whom she could exercise the small, petty power she felt slipping away in every other aspect of her job. It wasn't a thought, it was a feeling, a dark, ugly instinct, and she had followed it. She had looked at Leo Washington and hadn't seen a person. She had seen a variable to be controlled, a disruption to her system. The realization was not a sudden epiphany, but a slow, sickening dawn. Her entire defense, the narrative she had built in her own mind of being the wronged party, the victim of a spoiled brat and corporate cowardice, crumbled into dust. She was the one who was wrong. It had started with her pride, her prejudice, her lie. Tears streamed down her face, but they weren't tears of anger or self-pity anymore. They were tears of shame. She had built her identity on being a professional, on being in control. But in that moment, she had been profoundly, catastrophically unprofessional. She had failed not just the airline's code of conduct, but a basic code of human decency. She thought of the other two, Peter and Maria. They had lost their jobs because of her, because they were too scared or too loyal to question her flawed authority. Her arrogance had burned their lives down, along with her own. In the depths of her despair, a new, terrifying thought emerged. She had to fix it. But how? How could she possibly undo this level of damage? An apology seemed laughably inadequate. There was no one to call, no one to write to. She was an outcast. But she had to do something, not to get her job back. That was gone forever. Not even to clear her name. That was a lost cause. She had to do it for the tiny, flickering ember of self-respect that remained within her. She had to own her failure. Completely. Publicly. She opened her laptop, the screen illuminating her tear-streaked face. She created a new anonymous email address. She found the email address for a journalist at the New York Times who had been covering the story, a woman whose articles had been surprisingly balanced. Her hands shaking, Carolyn began to type. "My name is Carolyn Hayes. I was the flight attendant on AA-100. I am writing to you because I would like to tell you what really happened, and I would like to apologize." It was a terrifying, desperate act, a Hail Mary into the heart of the media beast that had devoured her. It might make things worse. It might do nothing at all. But it was the only move she had left to make. It was a step out of the darkness of her own making into a frightening, uncertain light. The email landed like a flare in the digital darkness. It arrived in the inbox of Isabella Rossi, a sharp investigative journalist at the New York Times, whose reporting often found the human story behind the viral headline. The sender's name was anonymous, but the subject line was anything but. "I am Carolyn Hayes." Rossi, accustomed to hoaxes, was skeptical, but the message's raw, self-incriminating tone felt authentic. After a discreet verification process, confirming details, only Carolyn could know a meeting was set. They met in a nondescript coffee shop miles from Queens. The woman who sat before Rossi was a specter of the proud, immaculate figure from the viral video. Carolyn Hayes looked diminished, the sharp edges of her authority sanded away by shame, leaving a fragile, weary woman in its place. For 2 hours, she spoke in a low, halting voice, and Rossi listened, her pen flying across the page. Carolyn made no excuses. She didn't blame the entitled passenger, the ruthless corporation, or the vicious public. With a brutal honesty that was far more compelling than any defense, she took ownership of the moment that had shattered her life. "I didn't see a person," Carolyn confessed, her voice cracking. "I looked at a young black man in my first-class cabin, and I saw a problem. I saw someone who didn't belong. The rule about the water for platinum members, it was a lie, a pathetic lie. It was a power trip, a disgusting abuse of the little authority I had, because I felt my world slipping away." She dissected her own pride, her bitterness at a changing industry, and the unconscious prejudice it had festered. Tears streamed down her face when she spoke of her crew. "They lost everything because of me," she wept. "Peter and Maria. They followed my lead, and I led them straight off a cliff. Their failure was silence, but the sin, the real sin, was mine, and mine alone." Isabella Rossi's subsequent article was not a pardon, but it was a revelation. Titled, "The Flight Attendant from Flight 100, a story of pride, prejudice, and a painful reckoning." It refused to simplify. It presented Carolyn not as a one-dimensional Karen, but as a deeply flawed human being who had committed a grave error and was now entombed in its disproportionate consequences. The centerpiece of the article was Carolyn's full, unvarnished apology to Leo Washington, his family, her crew, and the public. The piece didn't extinguish the fire, but it fundamentally altered the nature of the heat. The monolithic wall of condemnation fractured, and through the cracks, a more complex conversation about cancel culture, corporate responsibility, and human fallibility began. For the other two crew members, the article landed with the force of an earthquake. In Ohio, Peter Davies read it on his phone, in the gloom of his living room. Carolyn's complete acceptance of blame pierced through his alcoholic haze. The resentment he held for her evaporated, leaving only the cold, hard reality of his own inaction. Inspired by her courage, he sat down, and for the first time in weeks, did something constructive. He wrote a long, detailed letter to American Airlines head office, not begging for his job, but outlining his failure as a bystander and proposing a new training program to empower junior crew to challenge senior misconduct without fear. In Miami, Maria Flores read the story with a pragmatic eye. Carolyn's apology provided a crucial narrative shift. Portraying herself as a victim of a toxic command structure, she gave a single, carefully worded interview to a local station. She used the fresh wave of sympathy to launch a modest GoFundMe, not for herself, but for a flight crew support fund, providing a lifeline for her family while she began retraining as a paralegal. The article also made its way to London, where Leo Washington was finishing his leadership summit. His father forwarded it without comment. Leo read it once, then again. The words of the broken woman on the page bore little resemblance to the monster he had conjured in his mind. Her raw shame, her grief for her crew. It washed away the last vestiges of his righteous anger, replacing it with a profound, uncomfortable sorrow. His victory felt tainted, the cost astronomical. He understood then that the immense power his name carried was a blunt instrument, and he had wielded it without thought for the collateral damage. In an act of newfound maturity, he bypassed his father's powerful staff. He contacted Isabella Rossi and asked her to pass a private message to Carolyn. It was short, but it held the weight of a resolution. "Ms. Hayes," it read, "this is Leo Washington. I have read your apology and I accept it. I want you to know that I never intended for this to happen, and I am truly sorry for the pain this has caused you and the others. I hope you find peace." For Carolyn, that message wasn't a key to her old life, but it was a key to a new one. It was a gesture of grace that allowed her to finally forgive herself. A year later, the world had moved on, but the four central figures of the Flight 100 incident carried its indelible marks. Carolyn Hayes never worked in the skies again. She found a quiet job as a dispatcher for a car service, her life smaller and profoundly humbled. The public shame had faded, replaced by a hard-won private wisdom. The woman who once policed first class with an iron fist now found a gentler purpose in ensuring people got home safely. Peter Davies's letter had, against all odds, found its way to the right desk. The airline, eager to show it was reforming, hired him as a consultant to help develop the active bystander training program he had conceived in his darkest hour. He found a new calling, not in serving passengers, but in serving the integrity of the crew. Maria Flores excelled in her new field. Her advocacy for airline workers had transformed her from a casualty into a champion. She was now a respected paralegal, fighting for others caught in the impersonal cogs of corporate machinery, her voice now strong and clear. And Leo Washington was changed most of all. The incident had been his crucible. He returned from London not as a quiet prince, but as a young leader acutely aware of the weight of his influence. He challenged the insular culture of his father's world, championing initiatives that used Ethelred's power for social good. He understood that true power wasn't the ability to ground a plane with a text. It was the wisdom and compassion to know when not to. The single ugly moment over the Atlantic had set off a chain reaction of ruin, but from that wreckage, 4 lives had been rebuilt into something stronger, more resilient, and more deeply human than they had been before. So what do you think? Was this a case of justified karma, or a punishment that spiraled terrifyingly out of control? The story of Flight 100 isn't just about one flight attendant and one teenager. It's about the hidden biases that shape our split-second decisions and the incredible, often terrifying power of both corporate influence and public opinion in our hyper-connected world. Who was truly at fault? Carolyn for her prejudice, the silent crew members, the airline for its brutal corporate calculus, or the unseen power that could ground a plane with a single text message? The lines are blurry and the answers aren't easy. We want to know what you think. Let us know your verdict in the comments below. If this story made you think, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates complex, real-life drama. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories that explore the grey areas of our world. Thank you for listening.